They were not prisoners of war. They were families, children, elders, entire nations. They were told they were being relocated. They were not told how many would die. Between 1830 and 1850, tens of thousands of Native Americans were forced to leave their homelands and walk west under military guard. What followed was not a migration. It was a slow catastrophe, a road marked by hunger, cold, disease, and uncounted graves. Here on Fragments of History, we explore the moments when governments stop moving people and start erasing worlds. If you value cinematic historical storytelling, subscribe and leave a like to support this project. Before the removals began, the Southeast was not wilderness waiting to be claimed. It was inhabited ground, mapped, worked, governed. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations lived there as organized societies with laws, diplomacy, and economies that had been evolving for generations. Later, white Americans would label them the 5 civilized tribes, a term that revealed less about native life than about the limits of the people judging it. The Cherokee, centered across what is now Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, had built institutions that mirrored and challenged the United States at the same time. By the early 1800s, they operated under a written constitution with executive, legislative, and judicial branches. They printed newspapers in Cherokee and English using the syllabary created by Sequoyah, an entire writing system formed by one mind, then carried into daily life by a nation determined to record itself. Schools, mills, farms, and public buildings were not anomalies. New Echota, their capital, functioned as a seat of government in the full sense of the word. In Mississippi, the Choctaw maintained agricultural systems capable of producing surplus for trade. Their towns were not temporary camps but settled communities with permanent structures and civic spaces. Governance was formal. Law was codified. Diplomacy was continuous. Their relationships with European powers and the United States were written into treaties, documents that acknowledged sovereignty even as they narrowed it. The Creek Confederacy, spanning areas of Alabama and Georgia, was a political union of towns and clans, layered and resilient. Their economy blended agriculture, corn, beans, squash, with hunting and expanding trade. They had survived the first shocks of European contact through strategy, alliances, and force when necessary. They negotiated, adapted, and endured, even as the border of American settlement pressed against them like a blade. The Chickasaw in northern Mississippi and Tennessee were known for military strength and political calculation. They navigated French, Spanish, British, and American ambitions with a focus on survival and autonomy. Their lands were fertile and heavily desired. Their leadership understood that power on a map meant nothing unless it could be defended in courts, councils, and, when the world offered no other language, in war. The Seminole in Florida were different in composition, and therefore especially threatening to the American order. They formed as a confederation, Creek people who moved south, indigenous Floridians, and African Americans who had escaped slavery and found refuge among them. They farmed, raised cattle, and defended their independence with fierce clarity. Their existence unsettled the racial categories slave-holding society depended on. To those who profited from bondage, the Seminole were more than a political problem. They were an unacceptable proof that another kind of life was possible. These nations were not frozen relics. They were living societies, adapting under pressure. Many people were bilingual or multilingual. Trade and market participation expanded in response to the world changing around them. Some individuals adopted practices from white neighbors in hopes of being treated as civilized on American terms. Others held tighter to communal systems, taking what was useful, tools, methods, new technologies, without surrendering identity. None of it was simple. None of it was uniform. The Southeast contained many nations, and within each nation, many arguments over how to survive. Religion and education reflected that same complexity. Traditional spirituality continued, sometimes alongside Christianity, sometimes under the shadow of missionaries. Knowledge passed through ceremony, oral tradition, and apprenticeship, while formal schools taught reading and arithmetic, some run by missionaries, others by native governments themselves. Literacy among the Cherokee in the 1820s could match, and sometimes exceed, that of nearby white frontier communities. This was not a primitive world being introduced to order. It was a literate world, defending itself with every tool it was told would earn its safety. The landscape itself carried evidence. Traditional structures stood beside log cabins and framed houses. Roads connected towns, mills turned along rivers, ferries crossed waterways, fields were fenced and worked. This was developed land, threaded with infrastructure and memory. Land where families knew the names of streams, the seasons of soil, the boundaries of sacred places. And the relationship with the United States was neither distant nor naive. These nations sent delegations to Washington. They negotiated treaties. They hired lawyers. They argued in American courts. Often, they understood the machinery of American law better than the settlers trespassing onto their land. But the law was never a neutral shield. Coexistence was never equal, and it was never freely chosen. Treaties were signed under pressure, under threat, under the weight of inevitability. Each land cession was described as the last, until another demand arrived. The nations adapted again and again, as if compliance could be exchanged for permanence. They built governments, schools, farms, and newspapers. They pursued legal recognition. They tried to prove, by the standards forced upon them, that they belonged where their ancestors had lived for millennia. But adaptation did not produce security. It produced desire. The problem was not that these nations could not coexist with American expansion. The problem was that they did, too visibly, too successfully, on land that others wanted. Their territories contained fertile fields, established towns and resources that settlers and speculators intended to take. Their sovereignty, existing inside the boundaries of states hungry for control, became an intolerable contradiction to governments that claimed absolute jurisdiction. By the 1820s, the pressure tightened. Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi pushed laws claiming authority over native territories, undermining tribal governance and declaring native legal systems void. Settlers moved onto native land with confidence, protected by state power and the silence of enforcement. Violence went unpunished. The federal government, bound by treaty obligations, increasingly leaned toward the states and the expansion they demanded. Inside native communities, the danger was visible and immediate. Leaders debated what survival would look like when the rules kept changing. Some believed legal resistance could still hold the line. Cherokee Principal, Chief John Ross, pursued challenges to Georgia's attempts to seize Cherokee land. Others argued that removal was inevitable, that the only choice left was how much could be saved by negotiating the terms of loss. These divisions did not begin with removal. They were created by it, years before the first march. And still, the world remained alive. Working fields, council houses, schools, trade routes, ceremonies, families. A civilization continuing, not fading. It would not be destroyed by a decisive battle. It would be dismantled by paperwork, votes and signatures, by decisions made far away by men who did not know these towns, did not walk these roads, and did not care what would happen when the state decided that a people's presence was an obstacle. Removal would be sold as protection, humanitarian relocation, a voluntary move to safety, new land in the West where native nations could live undisturbed. But what waited behind the language was not refuge. It was erasure, an administrative ethnic cleansing designed to empty valuable land without naming the crime. And before anyone collapsed on the road, before the first winter and the first epidemics, the machinery had to be legalized. That law was coming, and the man pushing it had built his career on hostility toward native nations, backed by a Congress willing to trade human lives for territory. Andrew Jackson entered the presidency in 1829, carrying a lifetime of hostility toward native peoples. As a military commander, he had fought the Creek Nation and forced the cession of millions of acres after the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. He had pursued the Seminole into Florida, executing Creek leaders and escalating the violence that became the First Seminole War. His reputation was built on indigenous suffering, and he never hid what he believed. Native nations had no right to occupy land white Americans wanted. Jackson also understood power. The Southeastern states were demanding action, and they had leverage. Georgia wanted Cherokee territory, especially after gold was discovered there in 1829. Alabama wanted Creek lands. Mississippi wanted Choctaw and Chickasaw territories. These states held influence in Congress and electoral votes Jackson needed. The native nations had neither votes nor the military strength to resist federal force. The calculation was cold and simple. Remove them, and the political machine keeps moving. On May 28, 1830, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act by narrow margins, 28 to 19 in the Senate, 102 to 97 in the House. The law authorized the president to negotiate treaties with native nations east of the Mississippi River, trading their homelands for territory in the west, designated as Indian Territory, primarily present-day Oklahoma. On paper, removal would be voluntary. The government would cover moving costs. Assistance would be provided during relocation. The language was administrative. Land exchanges, negotiations, logistical support. It read like routine governance. That tone was part of its design. By framing forced displacement as treaty-making, the government wrapped coercion in legality. It made deportation sound like agreement. It turned erasure into paperwork. Behind the bureaucracy was open racism. Congressional debate leaned on claims that native peoples were inherently inferior, incapable of civilization, obstacles to progress. Supporters called removal humanitarian, insisting it would protect native communities from hostile state governments. It was paternalism with a blade inside it. White America cast itself as rescuer while ignoring the obvious truth that white expansion was the source of the danger. Opponents argued the act violated treaties and basic morality. Senator Theodore Frelinghuysen of New Jersey gave a 6-hour speech defending native rights and pointing to treaty guarantees. Congressman David Crockett of Tennessee voted against removal, calling it unjust. Religious groups, Quakers and some missionary organizations, organized petitions against forced displacement. But moral language could not compete with land. The territories these nations occupied were valuable in ways politicians could measure. Cherokee land in Georgia held gold, and the Georgia Gold Rush beginning in 1829 drew miners onto Cherokee ground illegally, with state support. Alabama and Mississippi contained rich farmland suited to cotton plantations worked by enslaved labor, a system that demanded expansion to feed its profits. Economic interest did not simply outweigh ethics. It erased them. An ideology hovered over it all. Manifest destiny, the belief that American expansion across the continent was inevitable and divinely sanctioned. If expansion was destiny, then native nations were not peoples with rights. They were obstacles. Their sovereignty, their cultures, their lives could be treated as collateral in a national story that called theft a mission. The act quickly faced legal resistance. The Cherokee Nation, having built an American-style government and legal system, sued Georgia to block state laws from operating within Cherokee territory. The case reached the Supreme Court as Cherokee Nation versus Georgia in 1831. Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that native nations were domestic dependent nations, not fully sovereign in the way foreign states were, but he still recognized they had legitimate claims to their lands that could not be violated without consent. A year later, Worcester versus Georgia went further. Marshall declared Georgia's laws had no force in Cherokee territory, affirmed Cherokee sovereignty, and held that only the federal government could deal with native nations. It was a legal victory with the force of clarity. Removal without consent was illegal. It did not matter. Jackson ignored the ruling. Whether or not he spoke the words often attributed to him, John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. The reality matched the sentiment. The executive branch refused to comply. Congress did not force compliance. Separation of powers became theater when the government no longer intended to obey its own restraints. Georgia moved as if the court had never spoken. It seized Cherokee land through lotteries that distributed native property to white citizens. It arrested Cherokee leaders and white missionaries who supported Cherokee sovereignty. It dismantled Cherokee government and claimed total jurisdiction. The federal government, bound by treaties to protect Cherokee rights, did nothing. The lesson was unmistakable. Rights existed only where power was willing to enforce them. Treaty negotiations followed under conditions that made the word voluntary obscene. Federal agents made the choice explicit: accept removal terms or face state governments that would simply take land without compensation, negotiate, or be crushed. Military force sat behind every meeting. This was consent manufactured by threat, agreement extracted under pressure. Some leaders signed in the hope of salvaging what they could. Others refused, knowing that signatures meant abandoning homelands held for millennia. These disagreements split communities under strain. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830 committed the Choctaw to removal. The Treaty of New Echota in 1835 committed the Cherokee. Signed by a minority faction most Cherokee considered illegitimate. Similar treaties followed for other nations, each one a document that pretended to be choice while closing the door on any real alternative. The states did not wait for orderly removal. They began seizing property immediately. Georgians moved onto Cherokee farms and took possession. Mississippians burned Choctaw homes to force quicker departure. Alabamians arrested Creek leaders to break resistance. The violence was not random. It was applied with purpose, make staying impossible, so leaving looks like survival. The federal government promised support for voluntary migration. In practice, removal was outsourced to lowest bid contractors who provided the bare minimum and pocketed the rest. There was no adequate planning for moving tens of thousands of people across hundreds of miles. No preparation for shelter along the route. No serious provisions for food, clothing, or medical care. No concern for how families would endure the journey or how they would live once they arrived. By 1831, the first forced marches began. The Choctaw went first, about 15,000 people driven west in winter conditions with inadequate clothing, food, and shelter. Thousands died on the way or soon after arrival. Reports reached Eastern newspapers describing the suffering, but the machinery was already operating, and the political will to stop it did not exist. This was what the Indian Removal Act achieved. It gave legal cover to ethnic cleansing. It turned theft into treaty. It disguised deportation as policy. It said nothing about death, but death was built into every provision. In the season chosen for departure, in the contractor's corruption, in the distance, in the hunger, in the exposure, in the promises designed to be broken. The law had passed. The Supreme Court had been ignored. The treaties had been extracted through coercion. The apparatus of displacement was no longer a threat. It was procedure. And now tens of thousands of people, families, children, elders, entire communities, would be forced to walk west under military guard, carrying what little they could, leaving behind homes, fields, and the graves of their ancestors. The Trail of Tears had begun, and the number who would die before it ended was a calculation the government never made, because it was a number it did not want to know. The voluntary removal promised in the Indian Removal Act collapsed into a military operation almost immediately. By the mid-1830s, the federal government stopped pretending native peoples were choosing to leave. Soldiers were deployed not as escorts, but as enforcers. What had been described as assisted migration became forced deportation at gunpoint. The Cherokee removal in 1838 made that transformation impossible to deny. General Winfield Scott entered Cherokee territory with 7,000 troops. His orders were direct: seize the Cherokee, hold them in camps, and move them west. No exceptions, no delays, no mercy for those too sick, too old, or too young to travel. Everyone would go, regardless of circumstance. Soldiers moved through Cherokee communities like an occupying army because that is what they were. They surrounded villages before dawn. They gave residents minutes to gather what they could carry. A blanket, a small bundle of food. Whatever a person could reach before a soldier's shout became a shove. The rest was left behind. Furniture, tools, crops in the ground, stores for winter. Homes turned into objects of someone else's claim in the space of a morning. Looting followed with a predictability that exposed the true purpose of removal. White settlers moved into Cherokee houses before families had even disappeared from view. They took livestock, stored food, tools, anything of value. They broke open what they could not carry. They burned what they could not use. Some dug into graves, searching for jewelry buried with the dead. Theft was not an accident trailing behind policy. It was part of the mechanism, ensuring that even the idea of return would be stripped of meaning. The arrests were indiscriminate. Soldiers did not separate those who had accepted removal from those who resisted. They did not pause for property deeds, legal papers, or permission slips issued by sympathetic whites. People were taken from fields without being allowed to return home. Children were taken from school. The operation was built for speed. It was not built for humanity. Families were fractured almost at once. Men were often held apart from women and children. Extended families that had lived together for generations were split without explanation. In the confusion, parents lost sight of children. Elders were separated from the relatives who cared for them. Social structure, one of the few defenses a community has against catastrophe, was broken by design. A people divided into pieces is easier to move, easier to manage, easier to destroy. The camps were not temporary shelters, they were cages. Thousands of people were crammed into improvised stockades with inadequate cover, little sanitation, and rations that rarely matched what the government had promised. These were not facilities meant to sustain life. They were holding pens where human beings waited for transport the way cargo waits for shipment. Disease spread through overcrowding with ruthless speed. Measles, whooping cough, dysentery. Illnesses that could be survived in ordinary conditions became epidemics in spaces where clean water, warm shelter, and basic care were absent. The camps did not merely contain people, they weakened them. Food shortages began immediately. Contracts specified rations, but what arrived was often spoiled meat, weevil-infested flour, and amounts that were always less than promised. People who had farmed and stored food for winter, people who had lived with self-sufficiency, were forced into dependence on contractors who saw them not as human beings, but as profit. Children suffered most visibly. They did not understand why they could not go home. They did not understand hunger that never ended. They watched parents try to preserve dignity while being treated like prisoners. They watched elders fade in places with no care for the sick. The damage was not only physical, it was a child's world collapsing in real time, with no language to explain it and no authority willing to stop it. Elders died in disproportionate numbers even before the marches began. People who had lived 7 or 8 decades on their land could not survive sudden displacement, inadequate nutrition, and exposure in camps with minimal shelter. Some died confused, not fully grasping what was happening, surrounded by families who could not protect them and often could not even bury them properly. Medical care was nearly non-existent. A few army doctors were assigned to camps holding thousands, but they had limited supplies and no power to delay removal for health. The sick were told they would be treated on the road or after arrival. It was not true. Those who could not walk were loaded into wagons when available. When they died, their bodies were left beside the route, another item removed from the ledger without ceremony. Dehumanization was systematic. The paperwork reduced people to numbers. How many held here? How many moved there? How many dead? How many missing? Administration became a kind of anesthesia. It allowed officials and soldiers to participate in cruelty without having to name it as cruelty. That distancing was not incidental. It was necessary. A government cannot do this at scale if its agents are forced to see every face as a life. Resistance was met with violence. Families who refused to leave were dragged out. Those who tried to escape were hunted down and sometimes shot. Leaders who protested conditions were arrested and isolated. The message was absolute. Compliance would be enforced, and suffering would be the cost of hesitation. Some Cherokee had already left before the military operation, taking removal rather than waiting to be seized. These early departures were used as evidence that the policy was voluntary, ignoring what voluntary meant under threat. Leave now under pressure or be taken later at bayonet point. Either way, the outcome was fixed. You were leaving. In some cases, the camps held people for months, waiting for detachments to be organized, for weather to shift, for contractors to bring wagons and supplies. During that waiting, bodies deteriorated, malnutrition weakened immune systems, disease spread, hope drained out of the days. By the time the marches began, many were already too fragile to survive them. White observers sometimes recorded what they saw. Missionaries, journalists, even some soldiers wrote accounts of suffering and degradation, but the records changed nothing. Policy had already hardened into procedure. The machinery was in motion. Individual compassion could not halt a system designed to move entire populations by force. What was happening had no precedent in American life up to that point. This was not soldiers fighting soldiers. It was not conquest in the old sense, where victors imposed terms after battle. This was the planned removal of civilian populations based solely on identity. Ethnic cleansing executed through law and carried out through military control. The Cherokee were not the first. The Choctaw had been marched west beginning in 1831 under similar conditions. The Creek followed in 1836 after resistance was crushed. The Chickasaw in 1837. Each removal repeated the same structure: capture, confinement, delay, deterioration, forced march. Each produced the same result: death folded into the process, not as an accident, but as a predictable outcome. The Seminole were different in one way. They fought. The Second Seminole War in Florida dragged on from 1835 to 1842, costing the United States enormous resources and producing no clean victory. But even among the Seminole who survived the fighting, many were eventually rounded up and sent west. Resistance could delay removal. It could not stop it. By late 1838, the Cherokee removal was fully underway. Around 16,000 Cherokee were in camps or already moving west. Humanitarian relocation had become armed capture. Policy had become catastrophe. And the worst part, the dying that would give the Trail of Tears its name, was still ahead, because the camps were only preparation. The journey remained. Hundreds of miles through unfamiliar country, in dangerous seasons, with inadequate supplies, under guards trained to treat delays as problems instead of people. The road west was about to become a graveyard, and the number of dead would never be complete, because many graves would never be marked, and many lives would never be counted. The Cherokee detachments began moving west in the fall of 1838, with the largest groups departing in late autumn. That timing was not mere incompetence. It was indifference with authority behind it. Military planners understood what winter travel meant across hundreds of miles, especially for people already weakened by months in stockades. They proceeded anyway because the mandate was removal now, and now meant marching into winter. The first killing cold arrived in November. Families forced from their homes with almost nothing had no protection for what was coming. Contracts listed blankets and clothing, but as with food, the deliveries never matched the promises. Too few blankets, too little cloth, too much missing, and too much profit made from what never arrived. At night, people pressed together for warmth, but bodies cannot replace shelter, and breath cannot hold back wind. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and there was nowhere to hide from them. Children died first, and they died quietly. Small bodies could not keep heat through the night. They fell asleep against their mothers and did not wake. In the morning, parents found them stiff and cold, still held close, as if closeness alone should have been enough. There was no drama, only the sudden fact of a child no longer breathing and the march waiting to continue. Food was measured to prevent immediate collapse, not to sustain life. Contractors issued salt pork that was often rancid, cornmeal that could be moldy, and quantities that were always too small. A day's ration might be a few ounces of meat and a cup of meal, barely enough for survival, never enough for long-distance travel, and certainly not enough for people already malnourished from the camps. Hunger became a constant pressure, not a moment of starvation, but a slow wearing down that made every mile heavier than the last. Water, when it was available, was not safe. Thousands moving along the same routes turned streams and crossings into disease traps. Dysentery spread through detachments with terrifying speed. The weak became weaker. The dehydrated could not recover. People stumbled, collapsed, and were loaded into wagons if there was space. Many died within days. Others were left to struggle on foot until they simply could not. Whooping cough tore through the children. The fits were violent, the air stolen in spasms, the lungs too small to endure it for long. In warmth and care, many could have survived. On the trail, cold, hungry, exposed, it became a sentence. Parents listened through nights filled with coughing, helpless and awake, watching their children lose strength day by day until the sound stopped. Measles moved the same way, silently, before anyone could see it. By the time the rash appeared, the disease had already passed through families. Complications killed children and weakened adults. There was no isolation on the march. People slept close, traveled close, suffered close. The vulnerable died first, but even those who began strong fell ill as the detachments pushed forward. The elderly could not sustain the pace. Men and women in their 60s and 70s, already weakened by confinement, were expected to walk 12 or 15 miles a day over rough ground in freezing weather. They fell behind. They were loaded into wagons already crowded with the sick. Many died within days. If the ground could be broken and time could be spared, they were buried without markers. If not, their bodies were left beside the trail, the living forced onward by guards and schedules. Bodies were abandoned because there was often no alternative. People were dying daily. A detachment could not stop for full ceremonies every time a life ended. Families did what they could. Wrap a loved one in a blanket if there was one to spare. Dig a shallow grave if the earth was not frozen. Pile stones if stones were available. Often there was nothing. Only snow. Only dirt. Only a body placed beside the road and the order to move on. Some tried to escape into the countryside, choosing the risk of dying alone over the certainty of dying surrounded by guards and constant grief. Most escapes ended in death, winter, hunger, unfamiliar terrain. But desperation does not calculate odds. For some, any death outside the marching line felt less unbearable than another night on the trail. The escorts varied. Some soldiers showed flashes of humanity, sharing rations, allowing longer rests. Others were brutal, beating those who could not keep pace, refusing pleas for medical attention, treating the Cherokee as if contempt were part of the uniform. But the system did not require cruelty to kill. It only required momentum. Cruelty simply made the numbers rise faster. Pregnancy did not pause the march. Women gave birth on the trail without shelter, warmth, medical care, or rest afterward. Some hemorrhaged and died. Some infants were born dead. Those born alive often lasted only days. Too exposed, too cold, mothers too hungry to produce enough milk. Life began under conditions designed for death. Wagons meant to carry the sick became moving coffins. People were loaded in the morning and dead by evening. The wagons had no springs. Every rut and rock became pain for those with fever or dysentery. There was no heat in winter, no protection from wind. Officers recorded losses in reports without ever having to look inside. Children watched parents die. Parents buried children. Families arrived broken, sometimes missing half their members. The trauma was not only grief, It was powerlessness, watching death come daily and being forced to keep walking, forced to leave the dead behind, forced to continue because the system offered no other option. Survivors carried questions they could never answer. Why did I live? Why them? What could I have done? The trail did not provide meaning. It only provided consequences. The distance was measured in death. Commanders noted locations by losses. 3 children at a crossing, 4 elders near a hill. The trail became a map of disappearing people. Not a route across a continent, but a corridor of graves, some marked with stones, most unmarked, many never recorded at all. Along the way, white communities sometimes helped and sometimes exploited. Some settlers offered food or shelter, others charged outrageous prices and profited from desperation. Some stole openly, knowing there would be no justice. The march exposed what humans could be when power made suffering safe to ignore and profitable to extend. By December, winter had fully settled. Rivers froze, making crossings more dangerous. Snow slowed movement and drained energy. Death rates rose beyond what was already unbearable. Some detachments stopped, unable to proceed, waiting for weather to ease, while people died in the waiting. Military reports stayed clinical. Daily progress 8 miles, deaths 7, desertions 2. Numbers without faces, miles without names. The administration demanded totals, not stories, because stories make guilt harder to manage. Some detachments tried different routes, hoping to find safer ground. There was no safe route. Northern paths were colder. Southern paths carried contaminated water. Crossings were dangerous everywhere. The problem was not navigation. The problem was the act itself, forcing thousands of weakened people to walk hundreds of miles in winter with inadequate provisions, under guard, with no capacity to stop when the dying began. When the detachments arrived, they were shadows of what had departed. 1,000 leaving might become 700 arriving. The missing were in the ground along the way, counted as losses or not counted at all. The survivors were sick, traumatized, and faced a second reality. They would now have to build life in unfamiliar territory with almost nothing. The Cherokee called it Nuna Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. The name held what trail of tears can soften. This was not sadness, it was anguish. A world collapsing one death at a time and being forced to keep walking through it. By spring 1839, most surviving Cherokee had reached Indian territory. They were fractured, diminished, alive, an achievement measured only by what it had cost. The exact death toll would never be known. Records were incomplete. Many graves were unmarked. Many who died soon after arrival, killed by the conditions created on the march, were not counted as removal deaths. But survivors did not need totals to understand what had happened. This was not relocation. It was a slow-motion massacre. Death spread across months and miles, less visible than a battlefield, and no less lethal. And the dying was not finished, because the land they had been sent to would prove almost as deadly as the journey that delivered them there. The Cherokee nation that emerged in Indian territory was a broken version of what had existed before removal. The Constitution, the newspaper, the schools, institutions that had anchored sovereignty were destroyed, abandoned, or left behind in pieces. The cohesion that once held communities together fractured under trauma and suspicion. In 1839, those who had signed the Treaty of New Echota against the will of the majority were assassinated by Cherokee who considered them traitors. The killings did not restore justice. They widened the wound, hardening divisions that would take decades to partially mend. Cultural transmission did not survive the journey intact. Elders who carried traditional knowledge died on the trail. Sacred objects were lost during forced departures. Ceremonial grounds in ancestral territories could no longer be reached. Young people who would have learned language, ritual, and practice in stable communities instead grew up inside displacement, inside hunger, sickness, and mourning. The living chain between generations was interrupted. Some knowledge vanished, not because it was forbidden, but because the people who held it were gone and the conditions that sustained it were destroyed. The territorial loss was absolute. Millions of acres in Georgia, North Carolina, and Tennessee, lands occupied for thousands of years, were gone. Ancestors' graves were left behind to be plowed over. Mountains that had held sacred meaning became scenery for outsiders. Rivers that had sustained life became property, fenced and claimed. This was more than loss of ground. It was loss of place as identity, the severing of a relationship that had defined who people were. The Choctaw removal beginning in 1831 established the template. Later removals would follow. Around 15,000 Choctaw were driven west in multiple detachments over 3 years, often in winter, with inadequate supplies. Death came early and visibly. Witnesses described families thinly clothed, exposed to rain and ice, many without shoes, trudging through snow while carrying children and what little they had managed to keep. When the Choctaw arrived, there was no prepared infrastructure waiting for them, no houses, no stockpiled food, no settled support. They were dropped into unfamiliar country and told to survive. The first years were catastrophic. Hunger, continued disease, and the disorientation of land that did not feel like home. Thousands died after arrival from conditions created by removal, deaths that belonged to displacement even when official tallies did not include them. The Choctaw social order was disrupted in ways that could not be undone. Traditional districts and towns could not be recreated exactly. Leadership rooted in specific clans and landscapes had to be rebuilt in a setting where old relationships no longer fit neatly. Some practices adapted, others thinned and disappeared, either because the knowledge holders were dead or because the environment no longer supported what had once been possible. The Choctaw endured, but they did not arrive intact. The Creek removal in 1836 was especially violent. Under mounting pressure, conflict erupted, what the government called the Second Creek War, a series of fights between Creek factions and between Creek and white settlers. The military used the disorder as justification to remove all Creek, including those who had remained peaceful. Around 15,000 were marched west, and some traveled in literal chains, shackled under suspicion of resistance. In Indian Territory, the Creek faced conflict not only with others, but among themselves. Those who had cooperated with removal and those who had resisted carried resentment that poisoned relationships. Rebuilding the Creek Confederacy, a union of towns and political traditions, was far harder when towns were scattered, leaders were dead, and trust had been broken by imprisonment and coercion. The loss ran deeper than politics. Creek ceremonies were tied to specific places. The green corn ceremony, central to spiritual life, had to be adapted without the original landscape that had shaped it. Stomp grounds had to be rebuilt from nothing. Medicines drawn from particular plants in southeastern forests had to be replaced or abandoned. Culture survived, but it survived in altered form, carrying the imprint of violent dislocation in every attempt to continue. The Chickasaw removal in 1837 was compounded by disputes over compensation. Funds promised for ceded lands were delayed, diverted, or stolen by officials responsible for administering them. Terms that should have provided resources for rebuilding dissolved into bureaucracy and corruption. The Chickasaw arrived with less support than even the minimal assistance other nations received. At first, they were forced to settle on Choctaw land under an agreement that generated tensions between the nations. Eventually, the Chickasaw established a separate territory, but the early years were marked by disputes over boundaries, resources, and governance. Political and economic systems that had taken generations to build in Mississippi had to be rebuilt from scratch by people still absorbing the shock of removal. Their economic losses were not abstract. Mills, trading posts, improved farms, structures shaped by years of labor, were abandoned or taken. Private and national wealth was left behind, looted or absorbed by the society that had pushed them out. Prosperity did not travel west. The Chickasaw arrived essentially impoverished, regardless of what they had once possessed. That impoverishment intensified every other form of loss. The Seminole were distinct in one crucial way. They fought longer than the others. The Second Seminole War, from 1835 to 1842, became the longest and most expensive Indian war the United States would fight. In Florida's swamps, the Seminole used guerrilla tactics that made conventional operations grind and fail. They inflicted casualties and costs that shocked the government. But resistance, no matter how determined, could not hold indefinitely against overwhelming pressure. Those Seminole who were captured or surrendered were sent west, beginning in 1836. Their detachments included black Seminoles, people of African descent who lived among the Seminole, some free, some enslaved, under conditions far different from white plantations. The government's confusion and opportunism over how to classify black Seminoles created further trauma. Some were sent to Indian Territory, others were sold into slavery despite promises made to secure surrender. In Indian Territory, the Seminole faced hostility from Creek, who viewed them as renegade Creek rather than a separate nation. Disputes over land, autonomy, and identity fractured an already traumatized people. Over time, they established a separate existence, but the process took decades, and tensions born from forced proximity never fully disappeared. Across all 5 nations, the losses followed the same shape even when the details differed. Developed agricultural homelands were exchanged for prairies many did not know how to farm. Elders died, taking irreplaceable knowledge with them. Governments were disrupted or hollowed out. Populations were reduced not only by death on the trail, but by the continued dying that followed arrival. Hunger, disease, and collapse extending beyond the march itself. The cultural damage was systematic, even when it was not always intentional. Languages weakened as fluent speakers died, and as children grew up in conditions where normal transmission was interrupted. Crafts disappeared when artisans were lost, or when the materials of southeastern forests could not be found in the West. Ceremonies tied to sacred locations or dependent on specific plants and waters could not be performed as they had been. Social cohesion cracked under pressure and grief. Those who had advocated removal and those who resisted carried mutual resentment. Christians and traditionalists struggled over the future direction of their nations. Mixed blood and full-blood members contested political control and cultural identity. These tensions did not begin with removal, but removal amplified them until they became wounds inside communities already bleeding. And still, the nation survived. They rebuilt governments, they re-established schools, they formed new economies in new territories. They held onto identity as distinct peoples, despite relentless pressure toward erasure. But survival did not mean restoration. The continuity with ancestral land and with ways of life rooted in specific places was broken. What was destroyed could not be recovered. The Cherokee nation, after removal, was not the same nation as before, even if it carried the same name. The culture that re-emerged was not identical to what had been lost. The survivors were marked permanently by the deaths they witnessed and the worlds they left behind. And even this hard-won survival would not be secure, because the government that forced them west would soon want the lands in Indian Territory too. The promise that this new land would be theirs forever would prove as worthless as the promises that came before it. Removal had not created permanent homes. It had only delayed the next phase of dispossession, waiting for the moment white settlement reached Oklahoma and decided, again, that native nations could not be allowed to control valuable territory. The Trail of Tears had ended, but the process it represented, the systematic displacement and dismantling of indigenous nations to make room for expansion, was far from over. Official records are nearly useless for determining the true death toll. Military officers recorded deaths they witnessed or that were reported to them, but countless deaths never entered any ledger. People who drifted away from detachments and died alone left no paperwork behind. Those who died in the weeks and months after arrival, killed by diseases contracted on the road or by the cumulative damage of hunger and exposure, were rarely counted as removal deaths. The numbers preserved in government documents are minimums. They do not describe the real scale of mortality. They barely outline its shape. The Cherokee removal shows the logic of undercounting with brutal clarity. Army records commonly cite roughly 4,000 deaths during removal from a population of about 16,000 forced west, around 25%. Even taken at face value, that is catastrophic. But it is also incomplete by design. It excludes those who died in the stockades before the march. It excludes those who reached Indian territory and died soon after from conditions created by confinement and travel. It counts the road and ignores everything that made the road lethal. Modern historians, using demographic analysis, comparing population data before and after removal, have argued for totals closer to 8,000 Cherokee deaths from a pre-removal population of roughly 16,000 in the east. If those removal-related deaths are included, the mortality is closer to half. Not because a single massacre occurred, but because a system was built that made mass death predictable. A nation can be destroyed without one defining battlefield. The invisibility of death was built into the process. When someone died during a march, burial was rapid and often shallow. Detachments moved on. Graves were rarely marked. No death certificates, no formal notices, no consistent naming. A person vanished into cold earth and administrative silence. If a family lost multiple members, there might be no one left who could list the dead. Entire households could disappear along the route with no surviving witness to report names, dates, or places. The trail did not just take lives, it severed the ability to remember them precisely. Children's deaths were underreported even more severely. Infants who died shortly after birth might never have been recorded as part of a detachment at all. Young children were inconsistently tracked in bureaucratic systems that treated people as quantities rather than families. The result is a predictable distortion. The most vulnerable age group, already dying at the highest rate, becomes the easiest to erase from the count. The Choctaw removal is even harder to quantify. The first major removals began before administrative systems were fully established, and many deaths occurred far from military oversight. Early detachments left behind minimal records. Estimates of Choctaw deaths range widely, often cited between 2,500 and 6,000 from a removal population around 15,000. But these figures rest on fragmentary evidence, not comprehensive documentation. In many cases, the record is not missing details. The record barely exists. Greek figures are complicated by violence before and during removal. Deaths in military actions were recorded separately from deaths during deportation, as if the line between capture and removal were clean. It was not. Someone killed while resisting forced deportation might be classified as a combat casualty rather than a removal death. Someone wounded during seizure and dying later could fall into either category, or neither, depending on who wrote the report. The categories were porous, applied inconsistently, and often served political convenience more than truth. Some Creek were transported by ship rather than by overland march. Manifests exist, but they are incomplete, and maritime deaths were easy to disappear. Overcrowding bred disease. People died at sea and were buried at sea with minimal documentation. Records show discrepancies between departure and arrival numbers without consistently explaining where the missing went. Hundreds, possibly more, vanished into water and silence. Chickasaw and Seminole documentation is thinner still. Smaller populations meant less bureaucratic attention. Some Seminole removals unfolded during active warfare, where record-keeping was chaotic or non-existent. Chickasaw removal was complicated by their initial settlement on Choctaw land, with counting and classification blending populations and blurring separate tallies. In some cases, it is not that the numbers are wrong. It is that a distinct number cannot be responsibly extracted from what survives, and even the deaths we can estimate fail to capture the full human cost because removal produced casualties that do not fit neatly into an on-the-trail category. people who survived the march but died within a year from weakened bodies, infants born into malnutrition and instability, people who lost the ability to care for themselves after losing everything that made life coherent, suicides. These deaths may not appear in official removal statistics, but they were direct outcomes of removal. Casualties of a process that did not end at the border of Indian Territory. Entire clans disappeared. Extended family groups that had existed for generations were reduced to a few survivors, or eliminated entirely. Clan systems were damaged not only by death, but by the scattering of survivors across unfamiliar ground. When there were too few members to fulfill traditional functions, the clan ceased to exist in practical terms, even if a handful of individuals lived on. Survival, in that sense, could still mean annihilation. Orphans created by removal faced catastrophic odds. Children who lost parents in camps or on the march often had no stable structure left to absorb them. Some were taken in by relatives or other families, but resources were so thin that taking in another child could mean risking everyone's survival. Many orphaned children died soon after, through illness, neglect born of scarcity, or simply the collapse that follows grief when there is nothing left to anchor it. There were also, what cannot be tallied, psychological deaths, people who survived physically but stopped functioning as they had before. Elders who had been leaders becoming silent shells, warriors who had carried pride becoming passive, emptied by defeat, women who had held families together becoming unable to care for themselves. These are not deaths that can be counted cleanly, but they were real casualties, lives altered so profoundly that the person who emerged was not the person who began the journey. Disease outbreaks in the years after arrival compounded the demographic collapse. Epidemics swept through Indian Territory in populations weakened by malnutrition, trauma, and inadequate housing and sanitation. These deaths do not sit neatly inside removal, but they followed directly from it, because the march delivered people already broken into environments where recovery was nearly impossible. Demographic comparison offers the closest thing to an answer, even though it is still an estimate. The 5 civilized tribes had a combined population commonly placed around 60,000 to 65,000 before removal. By 1850, their combined population in Indian Territory is often placed around 40,000 to 45,000. That suggests a decline of roughly 15,000 to 25,000 lives directly or indirectly tied to removal. Though every number is shaped by incomplete counts, inconsistent categories, and underreporting at every stage. Scholars disagree on specifics. Some argue pre-removal populations were undercounted because people avoided census takers. Others urge more conservative totals, attributing portions of decline to additional factors. But serious disagreement does not exist on the central truth. Thousands died who would not have died if left in their homelands. The true number will never be known with precision, because the system that killed also failed, sometimes deliberately, to document. Record loss compounds everything. Some officers destroyed embarrassing documentation. Officials discarded papers they deemed unimportant. As removal hardened into accepted history, there was little incentive to preserve evidence of atrocity. The result is permanent uncertainty, a death toll that remains disputed, not because the suffering was small, but because the documentation was never treated as sacred. Indigenous oral histories preserve what bureaucracy did not. Families remember who disappeared and where. These accounts are not census tables, but they consistently describe mortality higher than official figures acknowledge, supporting the conclusion that undercounting was severe and structural. The stories fill gaps left by paperwork that either could not see Indigenous life clearly or did not care to. That gap still haunts descendants. Citizens of the Cherokee Nation today often know some ancestors died on the Trail of Tears, but cannot identify exactly who or how many. Family trees contain blank spaces where people vanished during removal, with no record of what happened. That absence is itself a form of violence, erasing people so thoroughly that even their deaths become uncertain. Modern estimates for total Trail of Tears deaths across the removed nations commonly range from around 15,000 on the conservative end to 25,000 or more when indirect and post-arrival deaths are included. Those totals sit against a removal population that varies depending on which nations and years are counted, often cited from roughly 60,000 upward. However the categories are drawn, the outcome is the same: a mortality rate that would be recognized as mass death in any other context, sustained over years under the language of humanitarian relocation. But numbers are abstractions. They do not capture the child who froze in the night, the elder who could not continue walking, the mother who died in childbirth beside the road, the person who survived war only to die in a camp from disease and neglect. Each figure was a life with a past and a future severed. The incomplete record is not a harmless flaw of history. It is evidence of a process designed to minimize accountability. When deaths are not recorded, they can be denied or reduced. When graves are unmarked, memory fades. When the dying is spread across years and miles, it does not look like massacre, even when the cumulative result is comparable. What is certain is this: removal killed thousands who would have lived if left alone. It destroyed families, clans, and communities. It created trauma that outlived those who walked the road. It was not a natural disaster. It was policy, implemented deliberately, with results that were foreseeable and accepted as the price of emptying valuable land. The exact number will never be known, but the truth underneath every estimate is clear. The Trail of Tears was lethal on a scale the word removal can never contain, and the dying did not end when the marching ended, because the land they were sent to would continue killing them for years to come. Indian Territory was not the promised land described in removal treaties. It was unfamiliar prairie and plains, an environment fundamentally different from the forests, mountains, and river valleys of the Southeast. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole had built agricultural and cultural systems over centuries, shaped by Southeastern rainfall, soils, growing seasons, and ecosystems. West of the Mississippi, those assumptions collapsed. The land demanded different knowledge. The people arrived with no time to learn it. The crisis began immediately with food. Treaties promised rations to sustain families until farms could be established and self-sufficiency restored. In practice, rations were inadequate, delayed, or never delivered at all. Corruption was constant. Contractors billed for supplies that never arrived. Agents diverted resources. The people who needed food received fragments of what had been promised and what had already been paid for with land. The first planting seasons were catastrophic. People who had been successful farmers in Georgia or Alabama discovered that Southeastern techniques did not translate to Oklahoma. Seeds brought from home produced poorly in unfamiliar soil. Rain came wrong, too much in spring, too little in summer. The growing season was shorter. Crops failed or yielded too little to matter. Even when harvests came, they were not enough to feed communities already weakened by removal and still losing people to disease. Hunting offered only limited relief. The game was different, and the balance was already shifting. Buffalo herds that might have provided sustenance were being depleted by white-hide hunters operating out of nearby regions. The deer and forest game familiar to Southeastern hunters were less common on open prairie. The land required new techniques, new rhythms, new knowledge, skills that could be learned over time, but not while families were starving. Disease did not stop at the border. In many places, malaria was endemic. Epidemics swept through populations with little resistance left in their bodies. Cholera, smallpox, and other illnesses moved faster through communities weakened by hunger, exposure, and exhaustion. Vaccination and medical care that had offered some protection in the Southeast did not translate into safety here. Shelter was poor. Sanitation was worse. Any outbreak became catastrophic because survival itself was already fragile. The infrastructure promised in treaties did not appear in time, or at all. Schools that were supposed to be built were delayed for years. Agricultural implements arrived broken, insufficient, or missing entirely. Livestock meant to help establish farms was often sick, unsuitable, or simply never delivered, despite being purchased with ceded land worth millions. The promises were written down, they were not kept. Trauma followed the people into the West and turned inward. Internal conflicts fractured communities that were already barely holding together. In 1839, Cherokee, who had signed the Treaty of New Echota against the will of the majority, were assassinated, igniting civil conflict that lasted years. Greek divisions between those who had cooperated and those who had resisted deepened into lasting bitterness. Seminole faced disputes with Creek over autonomy and land. The crises outside were lethal, but the fractures within made coordinated survival even harder. Different waves of removal created their own tensions. Those who left earlier sometimes resented later arrivals who had resisted longer. Those who arrived later sometimes saw earlier arrivals as collaborators who had abandoned others. The blame was often irrational. Everyone had faced choices designed to break them, but trauma rarely produces fairness. Communities that needed unity were instead forced into suspicion, accusation, and grief, sharpened into anger. Political reconstruction was necessary and nearly impossible. Each nation had to rebuild government while confronting hunger, disease, and the immediate need for shelter. Leaders respected in the Southeast sometimes lost authority in the West. New leaders emerged, but legitimacy was contested. Instability spread through councils at the exact moment stability was most needed, and every dispute drained energy from the basic work of keeping people alive. Housing was grossly inadequate. Families lived for years in temporary shelters, dugouts cut into hillsides, lean-tos made from prairie grass, crude cabins that barely held back wind and rain. Assistance promised for building permanent homes rarely materialized. People who had lived in solid houses in the Southeast now lived in conditions that would have been unacceptable for livestock. The humiliation was not incidental. It was part of what exile meant in practice. Dependency followed as a consequence, and in many ways as a design. Displacement stripped people of property, tools, and established food systems, then replaced them with ration systems controlled by federal agents. Support was often calibrated to prevent total extinction while ensuring continued reliance. A dependent nation is easier to manage. A hungry nation is easier to pressure into new concessions. Economically, the devastation was total. Wealth that had existed in the Southeast, improved farms, mills, trading establishments, accumulated goods, was left behind or stolen. People arrived essentially impoverished regardless of their former status. The planter and the subsistence farmer were reduced to the same problem: survival. That shared loss could have created solidarity. More often, it created shared desperation, and the promised boundaries did not hold. Treaties had described these western lands as permanent, territories that would belong to the removed nations forever. But encroachment began within years. Squatters moved onto native land with impunity. The government that had promised protection repeatedly sided with trespassers or looked away, shrinking native territories through new treaties extracted under pressure. The pattern was familiar, only the setting had changed. Cultural erosion continued because the environment itself resisted continuity. Ceremonies tied to southeastern mountains, rivers, and sacred grounds could not be performed in their original places. Town sites and ritual spaces had to be rebuilt without the land that gave them meaning. For cultures deeply connected to place, this was not just displacement, it was spiritual dismemberment, being cut away from landscapes that held ancestral presence. Missionaries intensified their efforts, seeing trauma as opportunity. Some conversions were genuine responses to crisis. Others were pragmatic, shaped by unequal access to resources. Christians sometimes received preferential treatment, and missionaries sometimes offered material support that federal systems withheld. But conversion could also mean renouncing traditional practices that were among the last surviving links to pre-removal identity. Even faith became entangled with survival. Children growing up in Indian territory had no memory of the Southeast. They knew homelands only through stories, stories that became thinner as elders died and details faded into myth. Memory cannot sustain a relationship to land across generations without presence. Within decades, the prairies of Oklahoma would be home, simply because that is where childhood happened, while Georgia mountains became something spoken of like a distant world. Over time, the psychology of exile hardened. At first, some carried the hope, spoken or unspoken, that return might be possible. But as years passed, hope thinned into realization. This was permanent. Their children would never see the places where ancestors were buried. The connection stretching back millennia had been severed, and nothing in law or faith could stitch it back together. That kind of grief does not resolve. It settles into a people-like weather. There was resilience. Communities rebuilt schools and churches. They re-established newspapers and political systems. They preserved practices in adapted forms. Survival itself became a statement of endurance that should never have been required. But survival is not restoration. What existed in Indian territory was not what had existed in the Southeast. It was a diminished, traumatized, altered continuation. The nations persisted, but they were not unchanged. The people endured, but they carried wounds that did not close. Eventually, the land they were sent to became home, not because the treaties were honest, but because humans can adapt to almost anything. Yet it was a home built from loss, stitched together over graves, sustained by determination, forced into existence by theft. It was not the home they chose. It was the home they were made to create after the home they had known was taken. And even this forced home would not be secure, because within decades, the government would decide again that native nations could not be allowed to control even these territories. Oklahoma would be opened to white settlement. Forever would be revealed as the same kind of word it had always been, useful in negotiations, worthless in practice. The Trail of Tears did not end with arrival. It entered a new phase, slower, quieter, bureaucratic again. A phase where the dying continued through hunger and disease, and the erasure continued through dependency and pressure rather than marching lines. The exile was permanent, but so was the process that created it. Displacement that followed native peoples wherever they went, because what the government wanted was not just specific land, but the elimination of indigenous nations as distinct political and cultural realities. And that process, set in motion by law and carried out on the road, would continue long after the marches faded from view. The Trail of Tears was not relocation. Relocation implies moving from one place to another while maintaining continuity of existence. What happened to the Southeastern nations was the destruction of entire worlds, social, cultural, spiritual, and physical, and the forced creation of something fundamentally different in their place. People were moved, but what made them who they were did not survive the journey intact. It was not policy in any neutral sense. Policy suggests an administrative solution to a problem. The Indian Removal Act was not problem-solving. It was problem creation disguised as order. The problem was simple. Indigenous peoples occupied lands white Americans wanted. The solution was their elimination from those territories through methods designed to be described in language bland enough to hide what was happening. The Trail of Tears was a process of extinction that happened to be incomplete. The intent was not necessarily to kill every individual, but it was absolutely to dismantle nations. Cultural destruction was guaranteed. Demographic reduction through accepted attrition was predictable. The government understood what winter marches, inadequate provisions, disease and exhaustion would do to weakened populations. They proceeded anyway because those deaths were acceptable costs of clearing the land. This was territorial cleansing at continental scale. The goal was empty ground. Land without indigenous sovereignty claims, without communities that predated American expansion, without cultures offering alternative ways to live on and with the land. Legal language and humanitarian rhetoric softened the operation, but the outcome was the same as any openly violent clearance, people removed from places they had inhabited for millennia. It was war without battles, and that made it efficient. Traditional war requires armies, resistance, surrender. The Trail of Tears required paperwork, contracts, and soldiers used as enforcement rather than as combatants. It was the displacement of civilians by administrative mechanism backed by force held in reserve. The violence was structural rather than spectacular, less visible, easier to defend, harder to name. It was destruction by bureaucracy. Forms were filled, treaties were signed, contractors were paid, reports were filed, miles were recorded, deaths became losses. The machinery of administration turned mass suffering into a logistical problem and mass death into a column of numbers. That bureaucratic texture did not reduce the violence. It concealed it. The paperwork became moral camouflage. This concealment worked then, and it still works now. When atrocity looks like procedure, it becomes easier for comfortable narratives to call it unfortunate, complicated, tragic, but necessary. But the outcomes were not accidental side effects. They were foreseeable results of choices. The government chose winter departures. It accepted inadequate supplies. It tolerated corruption. It ignored legal protections. It allowed state seizure. It proceeded with full knowledge that thousands would die and treated those deaths as an acceptable margin. The result was civilizational trauma, damage so profound it altered identity across generations. The Southeastern nations were not simply displaced, they were psychologically shattered. Confidence that adaptation could secure safety was broken. Trust that treaties meant something, that courts could offer protection, that negotiation could produce coexistence, each was proven catastrophically false. The Trail of Tears did not just remove people from land. It removed the ground beneath their assumptions about how the world worked. The trauma was not only personal, it was structural. It disrupted the transfer of knowledge from elders to young. It severed connections to sacred sites where spiritual life drew its meaning. It broke social organizations that structured communal life. It forced identity to be rebuilt in environments that did not support the cultural foundations identity had rested on. This was not merely suffering, it was transformation under duress, a remaking that could never be reversed. What died on the Trail of Tears was not only people, but possibilities. The possibility that indigenous sovereignty could coexist with American expansion. The possibility that treaties were binding rather than temporary pauses before the next seizure. The possibility that justice could be pursued through law when indigenous claims were legitimate. The possibility that civilization, as white Americans defined it, would earn respect when indigenous nations demonstrated it. The Cherokee had become literate, politically organized under American models, and in many cases, Christian and agricultural, everything they were told would bring security. It brought them nothing except more elaborate justifications for removal. The lesson was merciless. No amount of adaptation would protect a people from dispossession if they lived on land someone else wanted. That lesson destroyed the foundation of accommodation as a strategy. The world before removal did not return because it could not. The land was occupied and transformed. Political autonomy was replaced by dependency and federal control. Cultural continuity was ruptured by the deaths of knowledge holders and the disruption of daily transmission. Spiritual connection to ancestral territories was severed by distance that could not be bridged. Some continuities survived, languages though diminished, ceremonies though adapted, political structures though rebuilt, identities though transformed. But these were survivals inside a fundamentally altered world, not a restoration of what had been. The nations that exist today carry inheritance and continuity, yes, but also inherit trauma, absence, and the permanent imprint of forced reconstruction. What the Trail of Tears reveals most clearly is how democracies commit atrocities, not always through sudden, chaotic violence that can be blamed on a few individuals, but through legislation, votes, contracts, and administrative efficiency. The Indian Removal Act passed Congress. A Supreme Court ruling affirming Cherokee sovereignty was ignored without consequence. Government systems functioned smoothly to accomplish ethnic cleansing under legal cover. That is what makes it so disturbing. It shows that systematic destruction can be produced by ordinary governance. When the people being destroyed are defined as expendable, voters supported removal, elected representatives authorized it, bureaucrats implemented it, soldiers enforced it. The system did what it was designed to do. The Trail of Tears also demonstrates that atrocity does not require constant hatred. Bureaucratic indifference is enough. Many participants may not have felt personal animosity toward indigenous peoples. They simply did not value indigenous lives enough to let those lives interfere with territorial acquisition. Death became regrettable but acceptable. Suffering became unfortunate but necessary. Destruction became collateral in the pursuit of interests defined as legitimate, and it established a template. Once a government learns it can dismantle nations through legal language and administrative force, the method becomes reusable. Forced relocations repeated across decades. Mechanisms shifted. Removal, treaties under duress, land seizures, systems designed to break communal life. But the pattern remained: destroy political and cultural existence while maintaining plausible deniability through procedure. The lesson is brutal and simple. Civilizational values mean little if they do not extend to those defined as other. American democracy coexisted with slavery, indigenous dispossession, and territorial conquest, not as contradictions, but as expressions of a system that distributed rights selectively. The language of liberty was real for those included in full humanity. It was irrelevant for those excluded. The permanent legacy is distrust. Native peoples learned that American promises are breakable, that treaties can be violated when convenient, that legal protection means nothing without political will. That distrust was confirmed repeatedly in the decades that followed. Every negotiation carries the shadow of broken agreements, the knowledge that forever has an expiration date when land becomes valuable again. And the Trail of Tears did not end when the marches ended. It continues in intergenerational trauma, in poverty shaped by forced impoverishment, in cultural gaps where knowledge should be but was lost when elders died and communities were scattered, in the rational suspicion toward a government that used law as a weapon and called it order. What was destroyed cannot be restored. The Southeastern nations that exist today are not resurrected versions of pre-removal nations. They are continuations forced into new forms, new creations built on ruins, carrying both inheritance and injury. Practices that survived did so through adaptation. Languages changed, diminished, or disappeared. Connection to ancestral land became memory rather than daily life. The Trail of Tears was the road where American democracy revealed that its values were negotiable when competing with expansion. It was the moment indigenous peoples learned that adaptation would not protect them from dispossession. It was proof that mass death does not require a single defining massacre, only forms, contracts, enforcement, and the political will to treat lives as an administrative expense. And it stands as evidence that the celebrated story of liberty and justice was, for indigenous peoples, a story of displacement and destruction, carried out through the very legal and democratic systems Americans claimed made them exceptional. The Trail of Tears was not a tragedy of the frontier. It was a design, a system built to empty a land without calling it war. No single battle defined it, no single massacre contained it. It was death by distance, and when the marches ended, something far larger than territory had been lost. A civilization had been unmade. If this story mattered, subscribe to Fragments of History. Leave a like so these documentaries can reach more people. And in the comments, which forgotten chapter of Native history should we explore next?